Jó napot kívánok mindenkinek. I will switch in English because this presentation, this panel will be held in English. So, welcome everyone, dear guests, dear professors, and first of all, dear students. I'm happy that you're all here. I know why you are here, but still, I hope that you are interested in the topic, because space matters, we need more space, and this panel is going to be about the space industry, Europe, the place of Europe, and the competitiveness of the European Union within this new global race for space. So first of all, let me introduce you our two guests, our two panelists. First of all, Costanza Crivelli Visconti. She's from Vienna. She's from the European Space Policy Institute. She's a research fellow seconded by the Italian Space Agency. Thank you for accepting the invitation. Our second guest is Norbert Aradi. He's Hungarian, he's from Budapest. He is from this university a few years ago, who remembers already? And he works now at the permanent representation of Hungary in Brussels. He's a space attaché of Hungary, and he is going to be in charge of the negotiations related to other space matters during the Hungarian presidency in the next 6 months. Thank you, Norbert, for accepting our invitation. And my name is Balázs Bartóki-Gönczy, Vice Dean for Academic Affairs and Director of the Institute of Space and Policy. So first, to put the topic into context, our panelists will talk in a few minutes about the question itself. So first, I would like to ask Costanza to make your introductory speech. Thank you.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me correctly? Okay, thank you. So first of all, I really want to thank you, Balázs, for having me and in my institute here, because the conversation of the competitiveness of the European space program is very relevant, because the future of Europe, and I would say the future of Europe in space, but not only, just the future of Europe in general depends very much on the amount of competitiveness that Europe can acquire at present and in the next few years. Sometimes we ask ourselves, why is space relevant? Why is space matters? Well, it matters in everything we do. It's a very big enabler of other technologies. We use it every day, as you well know, from a technological point of view. But also, if we think about economy, we have very big returns from space activities and services. If we think about the downstream, you have a lot of industry that is enabled only and exclusively because of space and satellite activities. But also geopolitically, probably Norbert will be able to tell us more about it. The competitivity of Europe as a region depends very much on this new arena that is really not so new. But it presents new characteristics in which we compete with other powers, with other global powers. And something that is really close to my heart is the social aspect, so the aspect of our identity as humanity, and also European, basically just European identity that comes from space activities, if we think just about space exploration. But talking more about competitiveness as a concept, I would really very briefly want to introduce the concept for who eventually is not familiar with it. So competitiveness is different than competition. Competition is a phenomenon, is a sort of something that characterizes the ecosystem in which some actors act. And competitiveness is a characteristic of an actor. Competitiveness is an industrial concept. So a company, a business can be competitive, but also a region. So Europe can be competitive, can acquire more competitiveness in the international arena by aggregating all of the market share or all of the contracts, all of the procurements that its industry acquires in relation with other global powers. So the point that I want to make on competitiveness is that it's not something that Europe can think that it can acquire once and for all, but it's a moving target. It's something dynamic that we always have to consider in relation to other actors. So if the US has more market share, then Europe has less. If China has more, then Europe has less. And when we want to foster European competitiveness, this has to be in our mind. Historically, Europe has had great shares, both in the upstream, so launchers, but also in the downstream. If you think about satellite manufacturing or Earth observation, still very strong. But still, we are losing a bit of our advantage, and we don't want that to happen because we want to maintain our status. And so this would be my introduction and why we decided actually to have a panel on this. We think is very relevant. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Norbert.
Hi, I hope you can hear me, everyone. Right now, maybe? Now? Better? Yeah? Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm really appreciate that it's I can present what we can do actually in space. Right now, I want to start with a claim that I'm not going to talk about official positions of the Hungarian government or nowhere near the provincial representation. However, I do feel like that the expertise behind what we are doing in Brussels, whether if it's the European Union focus or whether if it's completely focused on the European region, is quite important to show. And indeed, competitivity, it can derive from certain angles. From my own perspective, I would say we can, of course, look at the industrial aspect, but we also should look on the service aspect, we should also look on the technological aspect, and we should also look on the policy aspect. What actions are we taking? What actions are we missing out on? And how we can apply those kind of actions to certain policy dimensions. In terms of space and how we approach space on a global perspective, now that comes mainly from international forums and seatings. It's quite important for geopolitical reasons, of course. I don't know how many of you are interested in security and defense. I am not going to delve into that details too much because that defeats the point of the presentation. However, I also want to say that, of course, certain market shares and certain applications are indeed used in defense and security, which can be a measurement of competitivity. However, in terms of Europe and in terms of the actions of Europe we are taking in terms of defense, now that's solely for member states. So that's something where we can basically boost our capabilities. But I'm going to, if I may, I'm going to delve into a little bit more, just a little bit more, nothing too much, nothing too deep, but just quite enough for you to understand the interplay between different dimensions. In terms, if we were to approach space solely from the competitive aspect, I think we might lose the actual sense of how we manage space and what kind of applications are we managing in terms of space, because there's a lot of applications we can use. I can see in the audience that a couple of experts and former colleagues are here who are also covering different fields of space. Frequencies, for example, if I may address one dear colleague of mine, also bilateral aspects, for example, universities and such. So, competitivity might be one of the main measurements, but at the same time, it's not the only one that we should take care of. So, in my presentations, I'm going to go into these kind of details, and then we'll see how it goes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, I don't know if you know, but in Europe, we have the European Union, 27 member states. Europe has a space strategy. It's one of the competitors on the global field with China, with the United States, with India, with the emerging Arabic nations, and other, Iran, for instance. And we have the European Space Agency, which is not a subordinated agency of the European Union, 22 member states, including the United Kingdom. And this is the construction of Europe in space. And my first question is, what do you think, what are the advantages of Europe? And what are the disadvantages of Europe when they want to be competitive in this global new space race? Costanza?
So, yes, this is interesting. This is a very good point. That Europe is a very it's not a homogeneous actor. And when I think about what this brings in terms of advantages and disadvantages, really the answer is that historically it's demonstrated that there is not really inherent reasons why the Constitution of Europe, as it is now, can allow or not allow for Europe to be competitive at a global level. So the advantages and disadvantages of Europe in our global system, they derive mostly from two aspects. These two aspects are related to the overall system of rules and ecosystem and how the system is shaped in terms of demand and supply at a global level. We talk about open market and who is it that shapes really the rules of the game. And this is the first big factor that determines the ability of Europe to gain competitiveness and to gain more market share in our global market. And the second aspect is, of course, very relevant, and it's maybe more new, and it's a topic that is more industrial and more coming from the business world, and is that there are new actors entering the field, new industrial actors, and these industrial actors are using brand new techniques, business strategies, and especially in the United States. You are all aware of the existence of SpaceX. SpaceX is an actor that started as an insurgent, so a new actor in a market that became immediately an incumbent. Incumbent is an actor that is established, that has a dominant position in the market. So, if we wanted to speak about the conditions of demand and supply in our global market and how open is really our global space market, then the answer is that it's not really straightforward, because some market share assessments, they say that only 40% of the global market of space in both the upstream and the downstream sector. Of course, this is an average, so then other considerations may follow specifically for specific market sectors. But only not the majority of the global market is really open. And by open, we mean internationally competitive, that foreign providers can access other markets rather than their domestic ones. And this is particularly evident in the case of China and in the case of the US, in the case of Russia, because the whole institutional demand of their institutional programs is saturated by their domestic providers. So it's an approach that is very institutional. It has institutional arrangements, and it's in the direction of the protection of one's own market. And the thing is that these actors that are encouraged by institutional arrangements to enter the domestic market, they not only have a privilege and an advantage on their domestic markets, of course, but they also gain advantage on the international open market, so the resting 40%. And this means that European competitors, of course, have way less chances to access or to be competitive at a global level, and that these companies are those that, in the end, can really apply some, they call it market disruptive techniques to enter disruptively the market. But a European company that is not backed by big institutional support cannot do that at the moment, because it's not strong enough, of course. It doesn't have enough incentives. So to conclude, I would say that it's these two aspects. One is related to the ecosystem, to the rules of the game, to the institutional arrangements that the other actors apply, and the other one is related to the specific techniques that the businesses apply in the market, that can be market disruption, vertical integration, horizontal integration, and so on. But this is very, of course, very economic concepts. And this is also the reason why, if we look at the solution, but then we maybe talk about the solutions at a later stage, should look into a sort of harmonization of the tools that Europe has as a whole, because that's the way in which our not homogeneity in our policies and our industry can really, by being harmonized, we can be competitive with bigger space powers and just not be a spacefaring region anymore, but really become a space power that we can surely do. There's nothing inherent to our organization that precludes us from this.
Thank you. Maybe I will ask related to that about the geo-return principle, which might be one of the weak points of Europe. Norbert, same question to you.
Thank you. It's quite interesting what you are saying about advantages and disadvantages of Europe compared to the US or even China. I'm going to take a different approach, but I'm going to reflect on what you've said. So indeed, the EU and Europe has a strategy for space. In 2016, there was let's say, a bigger concept of strategy, which was not, of course, an official document, but it was at least the guidelines for what we are trying to follow in terms of space. Whether if it's Europe, whether if it's the EU, basically, it's not, of course, it's not the same, because as Balázs rightfully pointed out, we have the European Union, and under that European Union, we have a space program regulation of 2021, which establishes different institutions and roles of those institutions. And we have the ESA with a even longer standing constitution. But at the same time, if we were to address how the advantages are coming forward, or basically competing against the US and China, these are the main core institutions that we have to carefully look at, and also, of course, each nation that is part of these kind of institutions. Now, in terms of disadvantage or advantage, firstly, I would point out that the advantage comes from the single market that we have within the European Union, once we are going to reach, of course, a true single market for EU space. For the disadvantages, I think the best comparable measurement with regard to the US, and within the United States of America, we usually say that there is standardization. However, within the European Union, we usually say that there is regulations, and this is not the same. Whenever you are following standards and you are trying to standardize your industry, allowing for potential market access, allowing for smaller companies to flow through the market and basically join different concepts of space, it's much more easier than trying to regulate how you address these kind of markets and what kind of technology you are able to produce and you are able to introduce to these certain markets. This is why, or hence why, I would say, there are a couple of actors in space in Europe who are really big, and by big I mean billions of euros per year in terms of return, and smaller ones, like in Hungary, a couple of companies whose return is, not €1 billion per year. But there are people and companies who are developing complete systems, and then there are people who are developing different smaller assets or subsystems for this kind of stuff. Now, where we can play a bigger role is to tone down a bit on regulation and find a way for the rules of the market to enter to the rules of the regulations as well. Because within regulations, of course, there are international rules we should follow and norms and so on. I'm not going to dwell into that because it's really long. But generally speaking, we are not the ones who are trying to somehow suffocate the technology and the development. But we should also apply certain standards to have those equipments readily available within the European Union or in Europe as well. On the advantages, once again, just to reflect what you've mentioned about the market uptakes. Yeah, of course. So within Europe, within the European Union, we have, for example, a really successful navigation service, Galileo. And I think it was the last year's market report by EUSPA which analyzed that the European navigation system is more accurate than the American one, which is the so-called GPS. I think you're already familiar with that. So, of course, we are competitive in terms of certain aspects and certain services. But at the same time, how do we provide those services relies on each and every member state, and whether we should look at competitivity and advantages and disadvantages as a collection of Europe and the EU, or state by state, adding small portions to the competitive era. Market access-wise, with the new space industry, I think it's much easier for Europe as well, but at the same time, you need tremendous amount of money, even though, for downstream sector, I would say that's a little bit easier, but I'm not a businessman, so I'm not going to try to dictate the dynamic, but at the same time, if you have a software company and then you can use different information, it's easier for you, generally speaking, than trying to find space engineers and develop different technologies for the upstream sector. So whenever we try to reach a certain agreement whether Europe is lacking the position of being a space power, whether we look at Europe as a space power from a historical point of view, or from the angle of the school of thought of power. Yeah, we can also mention that we are not a space power because we do not have any joint defense aspects in terms of space. But then again, that defeats the point of the discussion. So I would say that we really should introduce something of a collection of measures that we apply to Europe, whether we are trying to compare it to different states. And I think that it's not the best idea actually to compare Europe to different states, because as again, we are doing something completely different than the US or China.
Even if we are different, we are in the same competition. And I don't know if you knew, but the United States is preparing to go back to the moon, 2028, 2030. They have very reliable rockets like the SpaceX rockets.
Those are the Falcon rockets,
the Falcon rockets, they are reusable. Europe had a very reliable rocket, the Ariane 5. The Ariane 6 is not ready, so we don't have capacity to go back. Russia has the Soyuz, China has its own Long March rockets. China has its own space station, the only nation have its own space station. The International Space Station will achieve its end of this life cycle, and the gate will be prepared by the United States, basically around the moon. Europe doesn't have any plan for space stations. Europe doesn't have any plan for cargo missions. They have 75 million spared for that purpose, but it's not enough. So my question is, what do you think, what measures should be taken to close the gap? Because we see that the gap between the US, Russia, China, and even India is increasing between Europe. What should we do in order to diminish this gap?
So I found interesting that in your question, in your preparation of your question, you mentioned several times the launchers, the budget, also the economic factor, and of course, I don't know if you noticed, but this is very common in our environment, is that the idea of regulation and the idea of law comes like after. So there is, as your question highlights, there is an interest and an important in how is the solution to be achieved. It has to be achieved through something else, something that is not, at least something that is integrative to law and to regulations. And what is it? My institute is the European Space Policy Institute, and as the word says, we deal with policy. In this case, what is really important in this case is to develop an industrial policy that is European and that is dealing and tackling the economic organization of Europe in order to then, of course, not export but inspire and make the also European way of industrial policy a sort of standard. So really the answer that I would give is to introduce, as you said, a really nice way to put it, a collection of measures. Of course, were measures to measure how each country is doing in terms of competitiveness, but the measures that I intend are policy measures. What is an industrial policy, and what is an European industrial space policy? It's every instrument that an institution such as the European Union can use to modify, to alter the economic organization and the industrial industrial base of Europe, in this case, because we talk about European, that is aimed to ameliorate its conditions and towards common elements of public interest. This is a very broad definition of industrial policy, but it's really very relevant to point it out. And industrial space policy is not a stiff and definite concept, because it involves and is very much connected with a lot of other policy sets and policy measures. I would mention 5 because this is what I deal with daily, and I think that each of these instruments is relevant for successful achievement of more market share and more presence of Europe in the global market. I'm talking from an economic point of view, but of course this is a topic that can be expanded. But budget is really what drives in this case, specifically for big projects like the space ones. We think about procurement policy. How is budget allocated? Of course, the geographical return at the European Space Agency level is of course a big discussion in the space sector. And
could you just explain in a few words what is geopolitical return?
Sure.
Because maybe not everyone is aware.
Sure. So the European Space Agency has 22 member states. Each of these member states, of course, is very different. They are very different one from the other. And in a few words, the geographical return is that in relation to how much budget a country puts into a certain project that is a common project to ESA, then it has some sort of returns. And the return that here I want to highlight and point out is the amount of contracts and the amount of budget allocation to their companies, to their industry. So we see that there is, if we apply the geographical, the geo-return, that's how ESA usually refers at it. Of course, there is an assumption that political competition, so the competition between member states, is in this case more relevant than industrial competition. So my industry from Italy in this case does not really compete freely with an industry from Germany, because Germany maybe put into that specific project more money than Italy did, or the contrary, of course. So this is, for example, something that has to be thought of. Now we don't have the answers to the geo return, otherwise ESA would probably have already changed it or amended it, or maybe they like it this way. And then I think about the European Union, that is also different member states than ESA. The question that is probably the most relevant, the difference or a sort of harmonization between policies that should be demand-oriented and policies that are supply-oriented. So how much demand and how much supply can satisfy and saturate the market. Then there are other policy tools, and if you'd like, we can really speak about each of them. I think then the discussion could become very long, but I'm thinking about research and technology and innovation policies, trade, of course, like trade policy and investment policies to have access to alternative finance. So but everything should go in the direction of these two elements that I mentioned before, that is the development of like the awareness of the situation in terms of demand and supply at the global level. In this case, we ask ourselves, what about the preference clause? So should we really act like the US is acting and China is acting? So to say that our institutional programs should rely only to our domestic, and with domestic I mean European providers, or should we open our market also to external providers for our institutional and more like institutional programs? But can we be advocates of open market when other global powers really are not really going in that direction, are going in the direction of more protecting their own internal market? This is really an open question. And then, of course, other kind of policies to foster the other new business strategies of our new not incumbents, of the new actors that are in our European market. So innovation policy and federating different actors together, from academia to civil society to external advisories, to actually build solutions from a technological point of view. This is also another very broad topic, but I would act in these two directions through all of these collections of policy measures to build a common European industrial space policy.
Thank you, Norby.
Thank you. I also want to reflect on the launches just a bit, but I promise I'm not going to make fun of Ariane 6. But in terms of European launches, of course, yes, the French Ariane launches are quite famous, and I think you can see different posters and such on that, of that on the internet as well. So it's one of the main launches that are basically promoted. We also had the Vega before, but now that's also out of the question. In terms of the differences, and this is really important, I think, especially for measures that we should take. Europe needs a launcher policy. I wouldn't say that we need a launcher policy like the US has one, because within the US, of course, we are also speaking about SpaceX and the Falcons and the different rockets, but we also see a lot of companies delivering different, at least, stages of rockets. We can list for indefinite times the different companies that are able to produce rockets, or at least the technology that enables rockets to fly. This is not the case in Europe, or at least it's under the radar as of now. With a concrete and comprehensive launcher policy, which is not a strategy. It's really important that we do not need any more strategies. We have enough strategies. We need now concrete policy steps, taking a direction where we can finally deliver usable and applicable rockets and launchers, but that's only on rockets and launchers.
Sorry, and do you think when Ariane 6 will be the new rocket, basically, when it's ready, will it be still competitive with the Elon Musk Falcon rocket, which is reusable, until Ariane 6 will be not reusable?
I think it's two different characteristics. So the Ariane 6 is not going to be, let's say, a lightweight one. Of course, it's going to be, a new technology. So it's, in a certain way, it's going to be a more lighter one than Ariane 5 was, because Ariane 5, of course, it was one of the biggest rockets. But at the same time, once again, competing with the reusable rockets, I don't think Ariane 6 is going to be reusable, if I'm correct. But I might be wrong on that, but I think I'm not. But in terms of reusability and in terms of the, let's say, innovative technologies, Ariane 6 is not going to be the one that's going to save Europe from the launchers race, if I may put this in this perspective. However, it's going to be something that will be able to lift off the new constellations of Iris Square, for example, or the new generation of the Galileo satellites, and so on and so forth. But this is not the only race that we should face. Oh, that's not actually not should, but we have to face. For other measures, it was mentioned that opening up markets and other countries and other regions' markets and so on. So that's also a very important point, and I'm not going to argue with that. Actually, I'm going to agree with that. But what I'm going to also mention, which is, I think, is really important, we should not forget about the United Nations as well, and certain seatings of formations. For example, COPIOS in Vienna, where we have the legal and technical subcommittee. That's the English. The legal and technical subcommittee, for example, where states can come together and basically discuss on how we should approach and how we should forward space. We also have a lot of different subcommittees as well. We have also other international seatings as well, where we can talk about the regulations that we should actually apply to space. Whether those can be responsible behavior, for example, which more related to, of course, to defense and security. But then again, it's also very important that we are not trying to regulate the technologies. We are trying to regulate what we are doing in terms of space. And if we are trying to regulate the norms and the rules of how we use and apply space, we are going to be able to subtract the measures and the action steps we need to create a policy basis. And once again, I'm not talking about strategies, because we have a lot of strategies, but we need a policy basis to forward, and we need concrete actions to forward, especially within the European Union. Europe, it's easier with ESA, because ESA has the concrete programs where you can subscribe as a member state, and you can basically deliver under the technical conditions that are listed. But in terms of the European Union, we have the multi-annual financial framework, which basically provides a budget for certain policy areas, including space. And under those areas, there are certain programs which are developed by, well, not the EU, because the EU usually works hand in hand with the ESA in terms of development. But what we need, of course, once again, under these kind of frameworks, is a policy basis where we can deliver, especially under the multi-annual financial framework. We need more money, because, of course, we are, of course, always lacking money, and this is, once again, for launches and for different satellites. But I think I'm going to stop here for now, and I'll let...
And now, as we run out of time, I have a question. Only one sentence, please, a response. I know it's very provocative, but what do you think? Can Europe be a space power compared to the US and China in the next 20 years?
One line. Absolutely, absolutely yes. If we keep in mind that being a space power is based on developing capabilities and acquiring autonomy. So yes, if we manage to do that, absolutely.
Grazie.
If we find the policy basis I mentioned, yes, we can. If we are not able to find that, it's going to be harder. We can, but it's going to be harder. Autonomy and so on and so forth, that's another question, so I'm only allowed for one line, but I would say yes, we can, if we found the policy basis. If not, then it's going to be harder, and it might take a little bit more than 20 years.
Thank you, Costanza, thank you, Norbert, and thank you for all of you. Thank you. Mindenkinek további szép napot kívánok, este óvatosan.